At 1:23 this morning, the main entrance of the central executive residence opened and Chief Executive Victor Roland walked out flanked by security personnel. The vehicle waiting was not official transport. It was a standard black sedan with civilian plates. Roland carried a briefcase and a small bag. He did not speak. He got in. The vehicle departed at 1:26 a.m. for the first time in the Republic's history. A sitting chief executive left the residence under court. Ordered eviction executed overnight by federal enforcement. The departure followed an emergency ruling issued at 11:47 p.m. by Supreme Tribunal Chief Magistrate Elena Varon. The chief executive is hereby ordered to vacate the central executive residence immediately and transfer all executive authority to the constitutional successor. Federal enforcement is authorized to facilitate this transfer. Non-compliance will result in forcible removal. The ruling was delivered to the executive residence, the Federal Enforcement Bureau, and the constitutional successor's office. The legal basis was a contempt order issued at 4:34 p.m. The tribunal found Roland in contempt for refusing to comply with a subpoena requiring testimony in a corruption investigation. The tribunal gave him until 11 p.m. to either testify or resign. At 10:53 p.m., Roland had done neither. At 11:47 p.m., the eviction order was issued. But here is where it shifts. At 12:02 a.m., Federal Enforcement Bureau Director Marta Kelvin issued a directive. The Supreme Tribunal has ordered removal of Chief Executive Roland. All personnel are to facilitate this. The constitutional successor, Vice Executive Nadia Soren, is now acting Chief Executive. All protective resources transfer to Soren immediately. The Bureau was not waiting for voluntary compliance. It was preparing for enforcement. At 12:17 a.m., Executive Protection Service Director Colin Traverse received the ruling. His personnel protected the chief executive, but the tribunal ruled that person was no longer lawful chief executive. The question was operational. Do EPS agents continue protecting Roland or transfer protection to Soren? At 12:34 a.m., Traverse issued a statement. The tribunal has ruled Roland must vacate. The constitutional successor is now acting chief executive. EPS will comply. Protective resources transfer to Soren. Agents assigned to Roland will facilitate his departure. This is compliance with a lawful judicial order. The EPS was not resisting. Roland would not have protection blocking federal enforcement. At 12:47 a.m., Federal Bureau agents arrived at the residence perimeter. 12 agents presented the eviction order to EPS personnel. They were allowed to proceed. At 1:02 a.m., Bureau agents entered the residence. The lead agent stated the purpose to Director Traverse. We are here to execute the eviction order. Is the chief executive present? Traverse confirmed and went to inform Roland at 1:08 a.m. Traverse entered Roland's office. Sir, federal enforcement is here with a tribunal order requiring you to vacate. The tribunal ruled you are in contempt and Soren is now acting chief executive. I recommend you comply and leave voluntarily, Roland responded. This is unconstitutional. The tribunal cannot remove a chief executive, only the National Assembly through impeachment. I am not leaving. Traverse spoke calmly. Sir, the ruling is legally binding. The Bureau will enforce it. If you do not leave voluntarily, they are authorized to remove you. I cannot prevent that. At 1:17 a.m., Roland stood and gathered personal items. He did not speak to Traverse again. He walked to the door. Bureau agents were waiting. Will you leave voluntarily, or do we need to escort you? Roland did not answer. He walked toward the main entrance. Bureau agents followed. EPS agents watched but did not intervene. At 1:23 a.m., Roland exited and got into the waiting vehicle. The vehicle departed at 1:26 a.m. The eviction was executed without physical confrontation. Now watch what happens next. At 1:34 a.m., Vice Executive Nadia Soren arrived at the residence. EPS Director Traverse met her. Madam Vice Executive, the tribunal has ruled you are acting chief executive. Roland has departed. EPS is now under your command, Soren responded. I am not claiming to be permanent chief executive. I am assuming duties as required by the tribunal's ruling. This is temporary pending legal resolution. My priorities are continuity of government and preventing escalation. At 1:47 a.m., Soren was sworn in by Supreme Tribunal Magistrate Lena Tovar. The oath was administered in the main hall. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the duties of Chief Executive and will preserve, protect, and uphold the Constitution. Soren took the oath at 1:49 a.m. She was now constitutionally acting Chief Executive. 8:02 a.m., Soren addressed the nation. The Supreme Tribunal has ruled that Chief Executive Roland must vacate office due to contempt. I have taken the oath to ensure government continues to function. All operations proceed normally. The constitutional system is working. I will brief the National Assembly today. At 2:17 a.m., Roland issued a statement from an undisclosed location. I was forcibly removed by federal agents acting on an unconstitutional order. The tribunal does not have authority to remove a chief executive. I remain the lawful chief executive. I was elected by the people. I will challenge this ruling. This is a constitutional crisis manufactured by political opponents. Roland was claiming he was still chief executive. Soren was acting as chief executive. The tribunal ruled Roland was no longer in office. But Roland refused to accept that. The question, who is the chief executive? There is a detail most people missed at 2:34 a.m. National Defense Command issued a directive signed by General Alexei Crane. All personnel are advised the Supreme Tribunal has ruled Vice Executive. Soren is acting Chief Executive. Chain of command now runs through Soren. All orders from former Chief Executive Roland are not recognized. Military personnel will follow the constitutional chain of command. The military was recognizing Soren, not Roland. If Roland attempted military orders, they would not be obeyed. 8:47 a.m. The Federal Enforcement Bureau issued a public statement. The Bureau has executed the eviction order. Roland has departed. Soren has assumed office. The Bureau recognizes Soren as lawful executive authority. At 3:02 a.m., National Assembly Speaker issued a statement. The Assembly will convene emergency session at 9 a.m. to receive testimony from Soren and determine next steps. The Assembly has constitutional authority over impeachment and removal. At 3:18 a.m., international observers issued statements. The Alliance of Democratic Nations, we are monitoring developments. The transition appears to have been conducted peacefully and in accordance with judicial rulings. We call on all parties to respect constitutional processes. At 3:34 a.m., Roland's legal team filed emergency appeal challenging the eviction order. The appeal argued the tribunal exceeded authority by ordering removal without impeachment. It requested immediate stay and reinstatement pending review at 3:47 a.m. The Supreme Tribunal denied the stay. One sentence. The request for emergency stay is denied. The eviction order remains in effect. At 4:02 a.m., Roland's team announced they would file separate lawsuit in federal district court seeking declaration that the ruling was unconstitutional. At 4:17 a.m., Soren held her first national security briefing. Present were Defense Commander, Intelligence Director, Foreign Minister, and National Security Advisor. The purpose was confirming Soren had access to all command systems and operational capacity was intact. At 4:34 a.m., reports emerged that Roland had arrived at a private residence 40 kilometers from the capital. He entered and has not been seen publicly since. This is the moment it stopped being routine. At 4:47 a.m., National Assembly leadership met. The question, did the tribunal's action bypass Assembly impeachment authority? If the tribunal could remove a chief executive through contempt, was impeachment unnecessary? Or was the tribunal's action temporary pending formal impeachment? At 5:02 a.m., Speaker Vex issued statement. The Assembly will convene at 9 a.m. We will hear from Soren. We will review the tribunal's ruling. The Assembly has sole authority over impeachment and removal. We need to determine whether the tribunal's action is consistent with that authority. At 5:18 a.m., public reaction intensified. Roland supporters gathered outside the tribunal building. Supporters of the ruling gathered at the Assembly. Security forces monitored both. No violence reported. At 5:34 a.m., Roland issued a second statement. I am consulting with constitutional scholars. The tribunal's action is unprecedented and illegal. A chief executive can only be removed through impeachment. I will return to the central executive residence. I will resume my duties. Roland intended to physically return. If he attempted re-entry, would EPs or federal enforcement block him? At 5:47 a.m., EPS Director Traverse issued directive. All personnel are reminded Sorin is lawful executive authority as determined by the tribunal. Roland is not authorized to enter the residence. If Roland attempts entry, personnel will deny access. At 6:02 a.m., federal enforcement positioned additional units near the residence perimeter. The Bureau was preparing for possible confrontation if Roland attempted return. At 6:17 a.m., Defense Commander Crane issued statement. The defense forces remain neutral in political disputes. However, we are obligated to follow constitutional chain of command. The tribunal has determined that chain. We will follow it. We will not participate in any action to reinstall Roland unless ordered by a court reversing the current ruling. At 6:34 a.m., Sorin made a statement. I am aware Roland stated his intention to return. The tribunal has ordered his removal. That order is binding. Federal enforcement and EPS are authorized to prevent unauthorized entry. I call on Mr. Roland to respect the judicial process and pursue legal challenges through courts, not through attempted forced reentry. At 6:47 a.m., the Assembly convened early, moving start time from 9 a.m. to 7 a.m. Speaker Vex opened. We are in unprecedented territory. The tribunal has removed a chief executive through contempt. That chief executive refuses to accept removal. We must determine whether the tribunal acted within its authority. At 7:02 a.m., Sorin appeared before the Assembly and briefed on overnight events and continuity of operations. I did not seek this. I assumed it because the tribunal determined it was necessary. I am prepared to continue for as long as required. But this Assembly has an essential role. If you believe the tribunal overstepped, you have mechanisms to address that. If you believe impeachment is necessary, you have authority to initiate it. At 7:23 a.m., debate began on a resolution calling for immediate reinstatement of Roland pending formal impeachment. The resolution argued the tribunal's contempt-based removal violated separation of powers. At 7:41 a.m., the vote. The resolution failed. 103 in favor, 137 against. The Assembly declined to reinstate Roland. A majority accepted the tribunal's authority, at least temporarily. At 7:58 a.m., a second resolution was proposed calling for initiation of formal impeachment proceedings against Roland. The resolution stated that while the tribunal's action was legitimate, permanent removal required impeachment. It authorized the impeachment committee to begin investigations immediately. At 8:14 a.m., that resolution passed 182 in favor, 58 against. The Assembly was moving forward with impeachment. The process would take weeks. The outcome would determine whether Roland could return or whether his removal would be permanent. At 8:34 a.m., Roland issued a third statement. The Assembly has voted to begin impeachment. I welcome this. Impeachment is the constitutional process for removal. It should have been followed from the beginning. The tribunal's midnight eviction was illegal, but I will participate in impeachment. I will present my defense. I am confident I will be vindicated. In the meantime, I continue to assert I am the lawful chief executive. At 8:47 a.m., international governments began issuing recognition statements. The Alliance of Democratic Nations formally recognized acting chief executive Sorin as the republic's head of government. Several major trading partners followed. The international community was treating Sorin as legitimate executive authority. Here are the three scenarios. Scenario 1, Roland accepts the impeachment process and does not attempt physical return. The Assembly conducts impeachment proceedings over several weeks. If convicted, Roland is permanently removed and Sorin becomes chief executive. If acquitted, the Assembly may call on the Supreme Tribunal to review its eviction order. The crisis de-escalates through constitutional process. Scenario 2. Roland attempts to physically return to the central executive residence. Federal enforcement blocks entry. Confrontation occurs. Roland is detained for violating the tribunal's eviction order. The crisis escalates into potential violence between Roland's supporters and security forces. Scenario 3. The Supreme Tribunal's authority is challenged successfully in federal district court. A lower court issues an injunction reinstating Roland pending appeal. The government now has two executives, both claiming lawful authority. Constitutional collapse occurs as competing judicial rulings cannot be reconciled. The security log shows that at 8:52 a.m. on the morning following the midnight eviction, former Chief Executive Victor Roland remained at a private residence 40 kilometers from the Capitol. Acting Chief Executive Nadia Soren was conducting government operations from the Central Executive Residence, and the National Assembly had authorized impeachment proceedings. The procedural record contains no entry resolving which individual holds permanent executive authority. What happens when judicial removal precedes legislative impeachment is not answered by the system that separates those powers. It is answered by whether the institutions meant to reconcile them can agree on sequence.